Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching Al24 News live from Algiers. Coming up next in our World News program. Dozens of people have been killed outside the western Ukrainian city of Lviv near the Polish border after violent shelling of Russian forces on the region. Plus, at least one person has died and many others have been left wounded after a residential building was hit in Kiev today morning. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan plans to meet in Rome today, Monday, with Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, to stress the economic sanctions Beijing will face if it helps Russia in its military operation on Ukraine. And protesters in northern Corsican town of Bastia stormed public buildings and hurled missiles at police in the latest outburst of an attack on a detained nationalist in a mainland French jail. Welcome again, and we start with the latest updates of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. Talks resumed today, Monday morning, between Kiev and the Kremlin after a weekend of Russian attacks that raised fears of widening of the military operation. According to reports, over 2,500 civilians in Ukraine's Mariupol killed in Russian attacks. And finally, Ukraine's besieged port city of Mariupol is running out of its last reserves of food and water, the city council said. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky again urges NATO to establish a no-fly zone over his country, warning that otherwise the organization will risk seeing Russian rockets falling on its member states. Let's have a listen.
I repeat again, if you don't close our sky, it's only a matter of time before Russian missiles fall on our territory, NATO territory, on the homes of citizens of NATO countries.
Dozens of people have been killed outside the western Ukrainian city of Lviv near the Polish border after a violent shelling of Russian forces on the region. The shelling left 35 killed and 134 wounded people. The operation took place moments before dawn in the region where NATO and US forces trained Ukrainian soldiers. Usama Ayedi reports.
The Russian military operation has expanded to its farthest as Russian forces reached the borders of the European Union and NATO. Russia bombed a military base used by Western volunteers less than 15 miles from the Polish border. A volley of missiles hit the vicinity of the town of Yavoriv, between the border and the city of Lviv in western Ukraine. The blasts of the International Peacekeeping and Security Center were heard for miles around, shaking windows and lighting up the pre-dawn sky.
The bombing of the International Center for Peacekeeping and Security killed 35 people and injured 134 others. Nothing was happening there that could threaten the territory of the Russian Federation, and just 20 kilometers away are the NATO borders.
The barrage of Russian missiles which slammed the Ukrainian army facilities left at least 35 deaths and around 134 injured people. The missile strikes came hours after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of trying to break his country apart, as well as starting a new stage of terror with the alleged detention of a mayor from a city west of Mariupol.
And I repeat once again, if you don't look down our skies, it's only a matter of time. Russian rockets will fall on your territory, on NATO territory, on the homes of citizens of NATO countries.
President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky visited wounded people at hospitals who were witnesses of the tragic missile strike slam of the city. The governor of the Lviv region, Maxim Kozitsky, said Russian forces fired more than 30 cruise missiles at the Yavoriv military range. The United States and NATO have regularly sent instructors to the range, also known as the International Peacekeeping and Security Center, to train Ukrainian military personnel. The facility has also hosted international NATO drills.
Russian and Ukrainian officials will meet via video conference today, Monday morning, in the latest round of talks between the two sides. And there are signs which offer a glimmer of hope for progress to end the war, which began with Russia's military operation on Ukraine on the 24th of February. Kiev's chief negotiator in talks with Russia, Mikhailo Podolyak, had this to say regarding this.
Negotiations with the Russian delegation, the fourth round, will begin in a few minutes. We will try to make them finally understand that the 90th day of war is the 90th day of the great achievement of the country. Our positions remain encourage peace and an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all Russian troops, and only after that can we talk about certain neighborly relations, certain political agreements.
At least one person has died and many others have been left wounded after residential buildings was hit in Kiev today, Monday morning, while according to Ukrainian Interior Ministry advisor Anton Gerashenko, 2 people were killed and 3 were hospitalized. The fighting now is in its 3rd week, continued to rise citizens' evacuation in the Ukrainian cities. The conflict has so far forced nearly 2.7 million people to flee Ukraine. Shells fell on the towns of Irpin, Bucha and Hostomel, which have seen some of the worst conflict during Russia's attempt to take the capital, Kiev.
There was a lot of shelling last night. I was hoping the front line would move away from us, from Irpin, so we decided to stay. But now, after such shelling, it's unbearable.
Ukraine says it has restored a broken power line to the Chernobyl power plant, which in 1986 was the site of the world's worst nuclear disaster. The plant is currently held by Russian troops. Ukraine's energy minister said that the national power grid company managed to restore the connection. The power is used to run pumps that keep spent nuclear fuel cool to prevent radiation leaks. And now Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmitry Kuleba went on American television to say that the getting more fighter jets is the most pressing issue in Ukraine's efforts to defend against Russia. Zahra Farjani has more details.
The US and its allies will likely not stop sending military equipment to Ukraine, despite the attack on the Ukrainian base. The Pentagon has repeatedly said it has several ways in, and officials insist assistance continues to make its way in regularly. On American television, in an interview with Face the Nation, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba asked the West and its allies to arm Ukraine.
What we are asking is a very simple thing. We say, arm Ukraine and we will do the rest. Give us all the weapons necessary and we will fight for our own land and for our people.
Kuleba specified that getting more fighter jets is the most pressing issue in Ukraine's efforts to defend against Russia.
The highest demand is in planes, in fighting jets, in attack aircrafts, because unfortunately the Air Force power of Russia and Ukraine are uncomparable.
Another big concern for US officials is fears that Russia could use chemical weapons. However, Pentagon spokesman made an important point on Sunday.
A country that has a reputation for using those kinds of weapons on people, and we know they have a program. And 2, we continue to watch for the potential, and I want to stress the word potential that they could be banging this drum with the intent of creating some sort of false flag event that they could use it as an excuse to escalate the conflict.
The U.S. has sent Ukraine more than $1.2 billion in security assistance since January 2021. And on Saturday, President Biden authorized an additional $200 million in small arms and equipment for Ukraine. In addition to the latest round of military assistance, Congress on Thursday sent to Biden for his signature a $1.5 trillion government spending package that includes $13.6 billion in assistance to Ukraine.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan plans to meet in Rome today, Monday, with Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, and stressed the economic sanctions Beijing will face if it helps Russia in its war in Ukraine. In return, China denounced disinformation from the United States after the American press reported that Moscow had requested Chinese military and economic aid in response to Western sanctions against its war in Ukraine.
We are communicating directly, privately to Beijing, that there will absolutely be consequences for large-scale sanctions evasion efforts or support to Russia to backfill them. We will not allow that to go forward and allow there to be a lifeline to Russia from these economic sanctions from any country, anywhere in the world.
Recently, the United States released a series of fake news targeting China on the Ukraine issue with malicious intent. China's position on the Ukraine issue has been clear and consistent. We have always played a constructive role in calling for peace and negotiations. The most pressing issue right now is for all parties to exercise restraint, cool the intense situation instead of pouring oil on fire, and favor diplomatic resolution instead of escalating the situation.
Hundreds of citizens have been arrested around several Russian cities after they took to the streets in order to denounce the Russian military operation on Ukrainian territories. At least 756 people were arrested in 37 cities of Russia, with almost half of them in the Russian capital, Moscow. Amid the expansion of Russian forces in Ukraine and the continuing military operation which is widening Ukrainian territories, thousands of people took to the streets of many cities around the globe, including Berlin, Belgrade and Paris, to show their support to the Ukrainian people and denounce the Russian military operation, which sees a very tense stage of fierce fighting. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov receives his Qatari counterpart Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani in Moscow to discuss the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. The two parts discussed as well the Iran nuclear talks now underway in Vienna. On the other hand, Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby said Russian forces are broadening their target sets after rockets hit a Ukrainian military base near the Polish border overnight.
We certainly noticed that these strikes were conducted overnight, early morning hours there, overnight here. We do know that there was some damage to the training facility, and we're still assessing and talking to Ukrainians about what else they've seen here. Look, this is the third now military facility or airfield that the Russians have struck in western Ukraine in just the last couple of days. So clearly, at least from an airstrike perspective, they're broadening their target sets.
The U.S. State Department confirmed on Sunday that an American journalist was killed amid the rising conflict in Ukraine. Police in the capital, Kiev, said in social media posts award-winning American journalist Brent Rono was killed by Russian forces in the Ukrainian city of Irpin, while another American journalist, Juan Arredondo, was wounded.
Well, this is obviously shocking and horrifying, and I've just learned about it as I came onto air here, so I will be consulting with my colleagues, we'll be consulting with the Ukrainians to determine how this happened and then to measure and execute appropriate consequences as a result.
Russia's finance ministry said today, Monday, it had approved a temporary procedure for repaying foreign currency debt, but warned that the payments would be made if rubles or in rubles if sanctions prevent banks from honoring debts in the currency of issue. Nabil Khazini has more details.
Russia's cut-off from key parts of the global financial markets by the West will become a lot clearer this week. Moscow is due to pay $117 million on two of its dollar-denominated bonds. However, it has been signaled that Russia is taking steps to pay international bondholders in rubles rather than dollar. The Russian finance minister Anton Silvanov refuted claims that his country cannot fulfill its sovereign debt obligations.
Claims that Russia cannot fulfill its sovereign debt obligations are untrue. We have the necessary funds to service our obligations.
The Russian finance minister criticized Western sanctions, which freeze government and central bank accounts in foreign currencies, describing this as a desire to suggest that Moscow is unable to pay its debts.
The freezing of foreign currency accounts of the Bank of Russia and of the Russian government can be regarded as the desire of a number of foreign countries to organize an artificial default that has no real economic grounds.
However, the International Monetary Fund chief, Kristalina Georgieva, warned that a Russian default was no longer improbable, as Western sanctions mean Moscow cannot access much of its foreign currency reserves.
In terms of servicing debt obligations, I can say that no longer we think of Russian default as improbable event. Russia has the money to service its debt, but cannot access it.
The Russian government also announced the freezing of $300 billion out of $640 billion of the country's reserves of gold and foreign currencies due to the sanctions imposed on Moscow.
Russian yacht owners are confronting rough seas throughout the world as countries sympathetic to Ukraine's suffering impose penalties, including asset impoundment. World leaders are hoping that tough economic penalties aimed at Vladimir Putin's inner circle of oligarchs would put pressure on him to cease his military operation in Ukraine. Now, British parliamentarians cheered as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, clad in army khakis, recalled Winston Churchill's wartime rhetoric and asked the UK to extend its military and humanitarian help to Ukraine during a video speech to the House of Commons, while the UK was quick to arm Ukraine, sending thousands of anti-tank missiles as early as January, and to support broad economic sanctions against Russia, which now include resident oligarchs Roman Abramovich. It has not given Ukrainian refugees the open armed welcome that they have received across the EU.
Possible way, the consequences of Putin's actions, there are consequences in relation to the suffering that we're seeing in Ukraine. 2.4 million Ukrainians have fled Ukraine, many not able to, and we're seeing the consequences of Putin's aggression. That's why it's so important for the rest of the world to be united.
To another story now, protesters in the northern Corsican town of Bastia stormed public buildings and hurled missiles at police in the latest outburst over an attack on a detained nationalist in mainland French jail. Sofiane Kenturi reports.
Around 300 hooded individuals used Molotov cocktails and other projectiles to target police and state institutions, setting fire to a public tax office, according to a statement from the local prefecture.
The
problem is that the Corsican file is extremely complicated, and I am not convinced that ministers are really aware of what's happening here. We want someone like Mr. Simeone who understands the problem of Corsican.
Qui sont pas pour la violence, mais qui demandent plus d'autonomie et une compréhension du problème corse, c'est ce qu'on veut. Voilà.
Protests that drew 7,000 people in the mid-afternoon turned violent. The prefecture reported in an update at 8 p.m. that 38 people had been hurt in the ongoing conflict, including 24 police officers. In the last week, there have been a number of protests on the island of Corsica, including some conflicts with police in response to Ivan Colonna's strangulation by a fellow inmate in a jail in southern France. The attack left Corsican militant in coma, prompting new calls for nationalist convicts from the French mainland to be relocated to the island. Colonna is receiving a life sentence from 1998 assassination of Claude Erignac, the prefect of Corsica, who personified the French state's power on the island with a separatist past.
And finally, we wrap up our news edition with more news around the world in this report by Hussein Berkan.
As many as 12 missiles have been fired towards the U.S. consulate in Iraq's Erbil. A U.S. official said there was no impact at the consulate, which is currently unoccupied. The missiles were fired over the border from Iran. Iran has claimed responsibility for a missile barrage that struck near a U.S. consulate complex in northern Iraqi city of Erbil, saying it was a retaliation for a Zionist entity strike in Syria that killed 2 members of its Revolutionary Guard. Strong, shallow underwater earthquake shook western Indonesia and the Philippine capital region Monday, but no serious damage was immediately reported and no tsunami warnings were issued. Greece's Prime Minister met with Turkey's president over lunch in Istanbul Sunday in a rare meeting between neighbors who have been at odds over maritime and energy issues, the status of Aegean Islands, and migration.
And now it's time to have a reminder of our main top stories. Dozens of people have been killed in outside the western Ukrainian city of Lviv near the Polish border after violent shelling of Russian forces on the region. At least one person has died and many others have been left wounded after a residential building was hit in Kiev today morning. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan plans to meet in Rome today, Monday, with Yang Jiechi, China's top diplomat, to stress the economic sanctions Beijing will face if it helps Russia in its military operation on Ukraine. And protesters in northern Khorasan town of Bastia stormed public buildings and hurled missiles at police in the latest outburst over an attack on a detained nationalist in a mainland French jail. That's all for me, Nadia Kasmi, and the rest of the team. The news continues on Alt 24 News. Bye-bye for now.